The coffee was still hot when the world cracked open. Marcus Webb stood on his porch in the gray Montana dawn, one hand wrapped around his mug, the other resting on the splintered railing he'd meant to fix for 3 winters now. The field stretched out before him, frost-white, silent, the kind of silence that made a man believe the rest of the world had agreed to leave him alone. Then he heard it, low at first, then everywhere. 4 black helicopters broke the ridgeline in tight formation, unmarked, descending like a verdict he hadn't known was coming. The rotor wash tore through the frost and sent it swirling like ash. His son Liam exploded through the screen door, 9 years old and wide-eyed, cereal spoon still clutched in one fist. The first door swung open. A woman stepped out, gray blazer, blonde hair alive in the manufactured wind, and walked toward him like she already owned the ground beneath his feet. Marcus hadn't let anyone this close in 5 years. What had last night changed? The town of Cedar Creek, Montana didn't appear on most GPS maps, and Marcus Webb had chosen it for exactly that reason. He'd driven west from Minnesota 5 years ago with Liam asleep in the back seat, and nothing in the trunk worth mentioning. A duffel bag, a toolbox, and a cardboard box sealed with packing tape that he'd never opened since. Inside that box, somewhere beneath old mail and a folded photograph, sat a Johns Hopkins medical diploma. He hadn't thought about it much. Some mornings he forgot it was there at all. What he hadn't forgotten, what no amount of Montana winter had managed to dull, was the shape of a particular night. The fluorescent hum of an OR at 1 in the morning, his own hands, steady as they'd always been, working on a brain he knew better than almost anyone alive. His wife Diane on the table, the monitors going quiet in a way that had nothing to do with equipment failure. He'd done everything right. It hadn't been enough. He submitted his resignation the following week, didn't ask for leave, didn't transfer to another hospital, didn't call the colleagues who left voicemails he still hadn't listened to. He just stopped, let his license lapse, drove until the highway turned to 2-lane road and the 2-lane road turned to gravel, and got out of the car in front of a farmhouse with a sagging porch and a field that caught the last of the afternoon light like something from a painting he'd seen once and never forgotten. The elementary school was 8 minutes away on foot. That was the detail that made him stay. Now he repaired tractor engines and kept a small herd and woke before 6 every morning to make breakfast for a boy who was, by any measure, the most opinionated 9-year-old in Cascade County. It was a quiet life. It was the life he'd built from the wreckage of another one, and he'd made his peace with the dimensions of it. Or so he'd believed, until the evening a stranger came running out of the dark. Audrey Sinclair had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 11 weeks, not since the afternoon her father's neurologist had set down a folder on a glass table in Seattle and explained, with the careful gentleness of someone who had delivered this news many times, that the tumor was inoperable. 5 separate teams had since reviewed the scans: Boston, Houston, London, Zurich, and Seattle. 400 combined years of medical experience, and every single one of them had arrived at the same conclusion. 2 to 4 months, Audrey ran a $4.5 billion biotech company with the precision of someone who believed that any problem, properly understood, had a solution. She had restructured failing divisions, negotiated acquisitions that her board called reckless and that later made them wealthy, and built a reputation for being the person in the room who did not flinch. She was 28 years old, and she had never once, in her professional life, accepted the word impossible as a final answer. But this was her father, and some nights that distinction between professional certainty and private terror became very thin. The night before she drove to Montana, George Sinclair had called her into his bedroom. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the drawer of his nightstand and removed a folded piece of paper, handwritten, worn at the creases, as though he'd unfolded and refolded it many times over many years. He held it out to her. Cedar Creek, Montana. Marcus Webb. I met him 15 years ago, George said. Medical conference in San Francisco. He was young, just out of his residency. But I've never heard anyone speak about the brain the way he spoke about it that evening. Like it was something sacred that needed to be understood before it could be touched. George looked at the paper rather than at her. I've thought about him over the years. If there is anyone left who might see what those 5 teams didn't, it's him. Audrey didn't bring an assistant. She didn't inform her office or schedule the visit through any official channel, because doing so would mean submitting to a conversation she couldn't have. Someone walking through probability tables, referencing contingency plans, using the phrase manage expectations in her presence. She rented a car and headed east out of Missoula as the afternoon light went copper and low across the horizon. The GPS lost confidence somewhere around mile 40 on a road that dissolved from asphalt to packed dirt to something that barely qualified as a road at all. Pine trees closed in on both sides. The headlights pushed a pale cone of light into the dark and found nothing reassuring. Then the right front tire dropped into a frozen rut at the road's edge, a small, definitive sound, like something clicking shut. The engine ticked as it cooled. The temperature outside was dropping below freezing. Her phone was at 7% battery. Audrey Sinclair, who managed thousands of employees and made decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, sat alone in a dead car on an unmapped road in Montana and understood, for perhaps the first time, the specific loneliness of a position where there was no one you could call without pulling an entire machine into motion around you. She wasn't afraid of being stranded. She was afraid of what it meant that she'd driven out here alone, with no plan B, chasing a name on a piece of paper her father had kept in a nightstand drawer for 15 years. Through the pine trees, a window glowed amber. She grabbed her coat and ran toward it. Marcus opened the door to find a woman he didn't recognize. Blonde hair plastered against her face, lips faintly blue from the cold, breath coming out in visible clouds. She was wearing clothes that cost more than his truck. She looked directly at him and said, with a steadiness that was slightly at odds with the rest of her condition, "My car is stuck. I need to wait until morning." No apology, no explanation beyond the essential. He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the door wider. He found her dry clothes, a flannel shirt, a pair of corduroy pants that would be too long, and showed her to the bedroom at the end of the hall and told her he and Liam would be fine out in the living room. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without waiting to see how it landed. She stood holding the folded clothes and watched him walk away. Later, she would think about that. How it felt to have someone do something for you with no visible expectation attached. She lay down, intending only to wait out the cold, and instead fell asleep almost immediately, deep and dreamless, the kind of sleep that had been unavailable to her for weeks. She didn't hear Liam pad down the hallway. She didn't hear the wind shift against the windows. She didn't hear anything at all until before 5 in the morning, when her internal alarm, reliable even in exhaustion, brought her back. She charged her phone just long enough to call a tow service and reach her pilot, who was waiting in the next town over. Then she made the bed, tucking each corner, smoothing the surface, folding the borrowed clothes, and setting them precisely on top of the pillow. It was the only thing she could leave behind that carried any weight. A folded sweater and a pair of corduroys, every crease deliberate, every edge squared. She let herself out before the sun came up. The door made almost no sound. Liam found the empty room first. He stood in the doorway in his pajamas, looking at the neatly folded stack on the pillow, and called down the hallway. "The lady from last night is gone, huh?" Marcus came to the doorway. He looked at the clothes, at the precision of it, the careful corners, the kind of care that didn't come from habit, but from intention, and he stood there longer than he needed to. There was something in the thoroughness of it that sat with him. Not gratitude performed for an audience. Something quieter than that. Something left behind by someone who didn't know any other way to say it. He was still thinking about it when Liam asked if they could have pancakes, when he poured the batter, when he stood at the stove watching the edges turn gold. He was still thinking about it when the sound began. Low and rhythmic and entirely wrong for 8 in the morning in Cedar Creek. He set down the spatula, walked to the front door, opened it. 4 black helicopters were descending onto his field in tight formation, their shadows sweeping across the frost like something predatory and deliberate. The rotor wash hit him like a wall. Liam appeared at his side, mouth open, cereal spoon still clutched in one fist. The first door swung open. The woman from last night stepped down, gray blazer now, hair pulled back. Nothing about her posture suggesting she had spent any portion of the past few hours in distress. She crossed the field toward him, with the focused economy of someone who had already decided how this conversation would go. Marcus stood in his doorway and watched her come. He could close the door. He'd done harder things. He didn't move. Her name was Audrey Sinclair, and she said it the way people say names that carry weight. Not with pride exactly, but with the flat certainty of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by the effect it produces. The neighbors who had drifted to the edge of Marcus's property, drawn by the sound, by the spectacle of 4 helicopters sitting in a Montana field on a Tuesday morning, stood at a careful distance and watched. Behind Audrey, a man in a charcoal overcoat stepped forward. He carried a briefcase and the expression of someone who had not slept and was managing it poorly. Audrey introduced him as Peter Nash, her chief of staff, though her tone suggested the introduction was a formality rather than an invitation. She looked at Marcus with the same directness she'd aimed at him the night before, when she'd stood on his porch, half frozen, and asked for nothing beyond a place to wait out the cold. The directness hadn't changed. The circumstances had changed considerably. Her father, she said, was running out of time. 5 teams, the best available, assembled from 3 continents, had reviewed his scans and reached the same conclusion. The tumor was inoperable. But George Sinclair had kept Marcus's name on a piece of paper in his nightstand for 15 years, and he'd asked her to find him, and she had driven into the Montana dark alone to do it. She needed Marcus to come to Seattle, to look at the imaging, to see if there was something 5 other teams had missed. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he said, "I don't practice anymore." 4 words, level as the frozen ground behind him. Peter opened the briefcase. Washington State had an emergency licensure provision for exactly this kind of situation, he explained. Temporary clinical authorization could be processed within 48 hours. Sinclair Medical Center had already initiated the paperwork. Every legal obstacle had a pathway. He spoke with the efficiency of someone who had spent the drive from Seattle preparing for this precise objection. Marcus listened to that, too. Then he shook his head. Not quickly, not defensively, the way a man sets down a heavy object he has no intention of picking up again. Audrey watched him. She read the refusal the way she read most things, not at face value, but for the architecture beneath it. The reasons he'd offered were real. They were not the reason. She asked to speak with him alone. Peter and the rest of the team retreated to the yard. The neighbors dispersed. The helicopter sat cooling in the field. Inside the kitchen, Liam was working his way through a bowl of cereal at the corner of the table, with the methodical focus of a child who is listening to everything and pretending not to. Audrey didn't open with numbers. She didn't reference the legal documentation in Peter's briefcase, or the equipment available at Sinclair Medical Center, or the combined credentials of the support staff already on standby in Seattle. She sat down across from Marcus at the kitchen table, and she talked about her father. Not George Sinclair, the founder of a biotech empire. The other one. The man who had taught her to ride a horse in the backyard of a house they'd long since sold, who had stood in a 2-row school auditorium and bought a ticket to see her perform in a 5th-grade play as though it were opening night at the Met. The man who had said nothing at all, when she'd lost her first major deal at 24, who had simply gotten into the car with her and driven loops around the city until she stopped crying, the radio low, the city lights blurring past the windows. "He didn't send me here because he thinks you have some miracle to offer," Audrey said. "He sent me here because 15 years ago, you were the only person he'd ever met who talked about patients the way you'd talk about people. Not cases, not technical problems. People." The kitchen was quiet except for the small sounds of Liam's spoon against ceramic. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Audrey had learned, in 11 weeks of sitting across from specialists and advisors and board members who delivered verdicts wrapped in qualifications, to read the quality of a silence. This one wasn't refusal. It was recognition. The particular stillness of someone hearing something they already knew said aloud for the first time. Peter came back in. He hadn't read the room, or he'd read it and decided to proceed anyway, and he began walking through the financial terms, the figure Sinclair Medical was prepared to offer, the scope of compensation for Marcus's time and expertise. Marcus looked at him. "Money isn't the issue." Peter stopped. From the corner of the table, without looking up from his bowl, Liam set his spoon down. "Dad." He said it simply. The way children say things they don't know are important. "If someone's dad is sick and you can help, you help. You always tell me that." The kitchen went completely still. Outside, the wind moved through the field and found the gaps in the old window frames and made itself known. Marcus looked at his son, then at Audrey. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down, the first time he'd sat since the morning began. "Tell me about the tumor," he said. "All of it." Audrey laid out the details with precision. The tumor was seated deep in the thalamic region, adjacent to fiber bundles governing language and memory. It had grown into a location where the standard surgical approaches, every established corridor, every documented angle of entry, placed those functions at catastrophic risk. The 5 teams weren't being overly cautious, they were being accurate. To operate by conventional means was to choose between the patient's life, his language, or his memory, and no surgeon had been willing to make that choice because none of them saw a way to avoid it. Peter produced a summary document. Full resources, best available support team, next-generation simulation equipment, comprehensive legal protection for Marcus at every stage. Marcus let him finish. Then he said the thing that nobody in 11 weeks had said to Audrey directly, without wrapping it in softness first. "Those teams weren't wrong. With standard technique, this tumor cannot be safely removed. I need to see the imaging myself before I say anything beyond that. And if I look at it and don't find anything different, I'll tell you that. Not what you want to hear. What I actually see." Audrey looked at him across the table. In 11 weeks, she had been handled carefully by everyone. Specialists who modulated their language to protect her, advisors who pre-filtered their assessments, board members who watched her face before deciding how much truth to deliver. Here was a man in a flannel shirt in a Montana kitchen, telling her plainly that he might confirm the worst and offering it as a form of respect. "That's exactly what I need," she said. The team returned to the helicopters as the morning stretched toward noon. Marcus told Liam he'd be staying with the Hargrove family down the road. Liam had protested this with a thoroughness that suggested he'd inherited something from both his parents. And then the house was quiet in a way that asked for an answer. That night, before any decision was made official, Marcus sat on the back porch steps alone. The sky above Cedar Creek was extravagant with stars, the kind of sky that required no power outage to appear, that simply showed up every night because nothing out here competed with it. He'd stopped noticing it for a while. He noticed it now. He heard Audrey's footsteps on the dry grass before she appeared around the corner of the house. She sat down on the step beside him without asking, which was, he was beginning to understand, simply how she moved through the world. They sat with the dark for a while, and then she spoke, not to persuade him, her persuasion exhausted for the day, but because she had run out of room to carry it alone. "I drove out here by myself last night because I couldn't have anyone in the car with me." Her voice was even unsentimental. If someone else had been there, they would have said something reasonable. Something about odds, or backup plans, or the importance of preparing for other outcomes. And I couldn't hear any of that. Not last night. She looked out at the field. 5 teams have already told me no. I couldn't sit in that car and listen to one more person start down that road. Marcus looked at the stars. "Are you scared?" "Every day," Audrey said. "Good," he said. "Fear in the right place keeps you honest." The screen door opened behind them and Liam appeared, barefoot on the cold wood, taking in the scene with the uncomplicated assessment of a 9-year-old who finds 2 adults sitting outside in the dark and decides this is fine. He came down the steps and sat between them without being invited, as though the space between them had been left there specifically for him. "Are you going to help the ladies, Dad?" he asked Marcus. No one answered right away. The field spread out before them, colorless and still under the stars. An owl called from somewhere in the tree line, then went quiet. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I'm going." He said it into the open air, toward nothing in particular. And what he understood, in the moment after the word left him, was that the decision had not been made just now. It had been made this morning, in a kitchen doorway, looking at a folded set of clothes on a pillow. The careful corners, the squared edges, the mute and precise grammar of someone trying to say, "thank you," in the only language left to them. He'd known then. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. Audrey didn't respond. She didn't reach for her phone, didn't signal Peter, didn't begin arranging the logistics that would need arranging. She sat on the cold porch step with her hands around her knees and looked at the same field Marcus was looking at, and the 3 of them, a man who had stopped, a woman who hadn't stopped since, and a boy eating a stolen cookie from his jacket pocket, sat together under the wide Montana sky until the cold finally made the decision for them, and they went inside. They arrived in Seattle before dawn. Marcus had 1 suit. He'd bought it for Diane's funeral and worn it once since, and when he put it on in the spare room Peter's team had arranged, it fit the same way it always had. Correctly, without comfort. He stood in front of the mirror for a moment, then looked away and picked up his notebook. Liam had been dropped at the Hargrove place the evening before. The goodbye had been brief in the way goodbyes are when a child decides to be brave, a hug that lasted slightly longer than usual, and then Liam pulling back and saying, with the gravity of someone issuing an official statement, "Don't mess up." Marcus had driven to the airfield with that in his chest. Sinclair Medical Center occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building that caught the early light and threw it back at the city in long, clean angles. Marcus walked through it without comment, reading the space the way he'd once read every room he entered. The equipment, the layout, the particular quality of quiet that a serious medical facility produced. Some fluencies don't go away. They just go unused. George Sinclair was smaller than the man Audrey had described without ever quite describing. The illness had done what illness does, reduced the volume, compressed the edges. But his eyes, when they found Marcus across the room, had not been reduced at all. They were the eyes of someone who had spent decades paying close attention and saw no reason to stop now. "I knew you'd come," George said. His voice was steady, if slower than it had once been. "I just didn't know Audrey would have to drive through a Montana field in the dark to find you." A beat of dry amusement crossed his face. "She's never done anything the easy way." From the corner of the room, Audrey said nothing. She stood with her arms at her sides and let the moment be what it was. Marcus sat down beside the bed and opened the file. It was 487 pages. He read for 2 hours, then 3, moving through the imaging reports and surgical assessments and the careful, qualified language of 5 teams who had each arrived at the same wall from a different direction. Audrey waited in the hallway. Peter brought coffee she didn't touch. The medical staff moved quietly around the edges of the floor, performing the particular choreography of people trying not to appear to be watching. When Marcus looked up, he asked Audrey to come in. He had spread several MRI sequences across the light board, overlapping films, different angles, a visual argument built from months of someone else's careful work. He stood before them with his hands at his sides, not touching the images yet, just looking. George watched from the bed with the patience of a man who had made his peace with waiting. Marcus pointed to one sequence near the outer edge of the display. It had been taken at an oblique angle, 23 degrees off the standard axial plane, the kind of framing that resulted sometimes from patient positioning and was rarely the sequence anyone led with. All 5 teams had it in their files. None of their reports discussed it in depth. He traced a line along the lower posterior margin of the tumor, not touching the film, just outlining with one finger the boundary he was reading there. A narrow asymmetry in the tissue density, subtle enough that it could be dismissed as scanner artifact. The kind of thing you'd skip past if you were already certain of your conclusion. "This is real," he said. His voice carried no drama, no elevation of register. He might have been pointing out a fence line on a property map. There's a margin here between the tumor and the healthy tissue. Thin, but present. Every team approached this from the anterior and lateral corridors, because those are the established routes. Nobody came at it from the lower posterior, because that approach is narrow and technically complex, and requires a positioning protocol that isn't standard. He looked at Audrey. "But it's a real margin. I can see it." Audrey couldn't read the films. She could read Marcus. The quality of his attention, the steadiness in his posture. This was not performance, and she had been around enough performance in the past 11 weeks to know the difference instantly. "What's the distinction," she said carefully, "between impossible and unapproached?" Marcus looked back at the films. "I'll operate." The preparation took 48 hours. Marcus worked through both of them with the systematic thoroughness of someone who did not trust shortcuts and had never trusted them. He reviewed every imaging sequence with the head of radiology, spoke with the anesthesiology team about the positioning requirements, read through every previous surgical note, not for guidance, but for the gaps, the things 5 careful teams had seen, assessed, and decided not to risk. He spent 6 hours with the simulation equipment, running the approach from the lower posterior corridor until the geometry of it was fully dimensional in his hands. He filled 4 yellow legal pages with approach diagrams, clean, spare lines, each decision committed to paper before he moved to the next. He didn't sleep much. He noticed this without concern. He'd never slept much before a surgery. The night before the operation, he was sitting alone on a vinyl bench on the 3rd floor waiting area when he heard Audrey's footsteps in the hallway. She came in and sat down without ceremony, looked at the pages spread across his knees, then looked at his face, then looked out the window at the Seattle skyline going dark. "I've never gone into anything without a contingency," she said eventually. The city lights reflected faintly in the glass. "My whole career, every deal, every expansion, every decision, I've always had a parallel track running. Something I could move to if the primary path closed." Her hands were folded in her lap. "Driving to Cedar Creek 2 nights ago was the first time in my life I had no backup plan. No alternative route. Just a name on a piece of paper and a rental car headed into the dark." Marcus was quiet, listening. "And somehow," she said, That was the first night I slept in 11 weeks. He looked at her in the partial light. I'm scared every time I walk into an OR, he said. Every single time. I used to think that would go away with enough years. It never does. He looked back down at his diagrams. But it's not the kind of scared that stops you. It's the kind that makes you slow down enough to get it right. And on the other side of that door, there's someone who needs everything I have. Neither of them moved to leave. The coffee on the bench between them went cold. The city quieted floor by floor, light by light, until the window showed more dark than glow. And still they sat, not filling the silence, not managing it, just letting it exist around them like something that had earned its place. The operation began at 7 in the morning. Audrey was in the waiting area before 6, in the same chair she'd occupied the night before, as though she'd simply never left. She didn't open her laptop. Peter had printed a briefing summary and left it on the chair beside her. It remained there, unread, edges perfectly aligned. She didn't check her phone. She sat with her hands in her lap and waited. The only useful thing she could do, and the hardest. A video call came in from Cedar Creek. Liam's face appeared on the screen, hair flattened on one side from sleep, eating what appeared to be someone else's toast. Is your dad in surgery right now? Audrey asked. Yeah. Liam chewed thoughtfully. He's really good, you know, even though he stopped for a long time. I know, Audrey said. Liam considered this with the seriousness of someone weighing a complicated proposition. I think he stopped because it hurt too much, not because he forgot how. Audrey looked at the small face on her screen. I think you're right, she said. Inside the operating room, Marcus stood at the table and understood that the thing he'd feared most, that walking back into this room would mean walking back into that other room, the fluorescent hum, the monitors going quiet. Diane was not what happened. What came instead was the work, the anatomy he'd drawn across 4 pages of yellow legal paper the night before, now present and dimensional before him. The instruments in his hands like a language he'd neglected, but never actually lost. He thought of nothing except what was directly in front of him, which had always, when he was honest about it, been the truest thing about him. The tumor was where the imaging said it would be. The margin he'd identified was real, narrow, demanding absolute precision, unforgiving of anything less than full attention. He worked from the lower posterior corridor with the deliberate economy of someone who had committed every measurement to memory and trusted the commitment. The fear was present throughout. He'd told Audrey the truth about that, but it sat where it belonged, behind the work rather than in front of it, keeping his hand steady and his attention exact. 10 hours and 20 minutes after the first incision, Marcus walked out of the operating room. The exhaustion was the deep kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself on the surface, but lives in the bones and the slow weight of the legs. His surgical cap was still on his head. His mask hung around his neck. He pushed through the door into the hallway and found the waiting area, and Audrey was already standing, already crossing the floor toward him, and she stopped 2 feet away and looked at his face. He nodded. Once. Slow and certain. Audrey nodded back. Behind her, Peter put one hand on the wall. George Sinclair's recovery was steady, and then remarkable. The tumor had been fully resected. The lower posterior approach had held. The margin had been real. The language and memory functions remained intact. In the weeks that followed, his speech was clear, his recall precise, the tremor in his hands diminishing to something barely noticeable by the end of the first month. 6 weeks after the surgery, George called Marcus on a Sunday morning. Marcus was outside splitting wood, which he knew because he could hear the particular quiet of a man who has just set something down and picked up a phone. I want to ask you something, George said. Not as your patient, as someone who has been paying attention for a long time. A brief quiet in which Marcus could hear the city sounds of Seattle through the line, so different from the sounds outside his own window. Have you thought about going back? Not to Seattle, not in any way that doesn't fit the life you have, but back to the work. The world you left is smaller without you in it. I thought you should know that someone who's been watching for 15 years believes that. Marcus stood at the kitchen window, with the phone against his ear, and the field stretching out before him in the early morning light. I'm not ready to say yes, he said. I know, George said. I just wanted you to know the door exists. Late November came to Cedar Creek the way it always did, quietly, without announcement, the light going low and golden, and the cold settling in with the particular permanence of a season that meant what it said. A dark blue SUV turned off the county road and came up the dirt drive and stopped in front of the house. No helicopter, no team, no briefcase. Audrey sat behind the wheel for a moment with the engine off, looking out at the field. Marcus was around back, splitting wood. Liam was beside him, which, in practice, meant Liam was sitting on the largest available log, issuing detailed commentary on each individual axe swing, a role he had appointed himself to without anyone's consent or encouragement. Audrey came around the corner of the house. Liam looked up with the uncomplicated recognition of someone encountering the obvious. You're back, he said, as though this had always been the plan. She sat down on the porch steps after Liam remembered, with great urgency, that there were cookies inside that required his immediate attention. The afternoon light came in, low across the field, gold and long-shadowed, the kind of light that made the ordinary world look like something worth preserving. You didn't recognize me, Audrey said. That first night. It was dark, Marcus said, and cold. He set the axe down against the wood pile. I remembered the clothes, though, folded on the pillow. I thought about it all morning. He looked at the field rather than at her. It was the only way I knew how to say thank you. I didn't want to wake you. The kind of silence that doesn't need filling moved between them and then moved on. My father asked me whether I thought you'd go back to practicing, Audrey said. Formally, I mean. Full practice. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know. She looked at Marcus directly. But I think you will. Because of the way you were in that operating room. That's not something you stop being good at. That's something you stop letting yourself have. Marcus didn't answer. He went inside and came back with 2 mugs of coffee and handed her one and sat down on the steps beside her. He held his mug with both hands and looked out at the field and said nothing, which was not the same as having no answer. The screen door swung open and Liam came out with a fistful of cookies and a full account of the week's events. A recess dispute resolved to his complete satisfaction, a science project of apparently historic ambition, a development in the ongoing saga of the classroom hamster that required significant narrative groundwork before the resolution could be properly appreciated. Audrey did not look at her phone. She sat with the cold November air on her face and Montana dirt on her boots and listened to a 9-year-old tell her about his week with the full attention of someone who had nowhere else to be and had only recently learned what that felt like. The field lay quiet and wide beneath the late afternoon sky. The coffee was warm in their hands. No helicopters, no briefcases, no weight of things waiting to be decided. Just the porch and the light, and Liam's voice carrying out across the frost-pale field, unhurried, unfinished, the way all the best things are.